The United States Army officially retired the Springfield 1903 as its own standard infantry rifle in 1937, replacing it with the semi-automatic M1 Garand, which this channel has already covered in considerable detail from the perspective of its own designer's own quiet, uncompensated career. That rifle was widely praised by commanders, including General Patton, as the greatest battle implement ever devised. Technical manuals for the same supposedly retired rifle were still being printed by the American military in 1970, more than 3 decades after that same official retirement had already taken effect on paper. That is not a typo. A rifle adopted before the First World War, officially declared obsolete before the Second World War even began, was still being issued, maintained, and formally documented by the United States Army as American soldiers were fighting in the jungles of Vietnam more than half a century after that same rifle's own original adoption had first taken place in a considerably different era of warfare entirely. This is the story of the Springfield 1903, the rifle American soldiers carried for more than 60 years, considerably longer than its own official retirement date ever actually suggested to anyone reading only the Army's own formal paperwork rather than the actual equipment records coming back from 3 separate wars, and the specific reason the military kept refusing to fully let it go, despite officially moving on to something newer decades earlier, and despite every subsequent advance in rifle technology across those same intervening decades. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the soldiers, the snipers, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. The Springfield 1903, a rifle and an institution. This channel has already covered from the perspective of its own origins and a rather embarrassing German patent lawsuit that forced the American government to quietly pay royalties to the same nation it would eventually fight a world war against, served as America's standard infantry rifle throughout the entire First World War, armed millions of American soldiers training and fighting overseas across every major engagement of that conflict, and remained the officially preferred service rifle for nearly 2 full decades afterward, before the Garand's own adoption finally displaced it in 1937. On paper, that should have been the end of the rifle's own Frontline story entirely. A respected veteran design gracefully retired in favor of a more modern semi-automatic successor, built specifically to address exactly the limitations a bolt-action design carried into any genuinely fast-paced modern infantry engagement. Reality played out considerably differently once the Second World War actually began, forcing the Army to reconsider a rifle it had already officially declared obsolete years earlier. The United States entered that war without nearly enough Garands in inventory to arm every single soldier the rapidly expanding military actually needed to equip on an urgent wartime timeline, forcing the Army to keep the supposedly obsolete Springfield 1903 in genuine frontline service. As a standard-issue substitute rifle for units, the Garand production lines simply could not supply quickly enough during the war's own critical early years. Some infantry units in both the Army and the Marine Corps continued carrying the 1903 well into the war's own later years, even after Garands had become considerably more widely available across most other units. Soldiers who had already trained extensively on the older bolt-action design, sometimes preferring the rifle they already trusted over an unfamiliar replacement, arriving mid-campaign when switching weapons mid-deployment carried its own genuine practical risks. Before we get into the specific role that actually kept this rifle relevant for decades after its own official retirement, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The rifle found its own genuine second career in a role considerably better suited to its own inherent mechanical strengths than frontline infantry combat had ever really been in the first place. Snipers do not fire rapidly the way an infantryman advancing under direct fire actually needs to, and a bolt-action rifle's own comparatively slow rate of fire, a genuine liability in a standard infantry weapon competing against faster-firing, semi-automatic designs on an open battlefield, simply did not matter to a marksman taking one carefully aimed shot at a time from a concealed position miles from any actual frontline advance. The Army modified the design specifically for this role, designating the result the M1903A4, fitted with a telescopic sight and stripped of its own now unnecessary iron sights entirely, becoming the United States Army's first genuinely standardized sniper rifle in its own military history, rather than simply an ordinary infantry rifle fitted with an improvised commercial scope the way earlier American sniping efforts had generally been organized. Marine Corps snipers found the older rifle's own inherent accuracy potential exceeded what the Garand's own sniper variants, the M1C and M1D, could actually match at extended range. Marine marksmen using the 1903 reportedly recording confirmed hits out to 1,000 yards in the Pacific Theater against Japanese targets, well beyond the roughly 500-yard effective range generally credited to the Garand's own comparable sniper configuration operating under the exact same combat conditions. That specific advantage kept the 1903 in genuine, active specialist service considerably longer than its own official infantry retirement date would ever suggest to anyone reading only the Army's own formal equipment timeline, rather than the actual field reports coming back from soldiers using both rifles side by side. The rifle remained in use as a sniper weapon throughout the Korean War. Some examples were reportedly pulled directly out of storage once that conflict actually began in 1950 and issued to soldiers who needed a genuine precision rifle considerably faster than any new design could realistically be developed and fielded from scratch during a war nobody had specifically anticipated fighting only 5 years after the previous one had already ended. Marine Corps armorers continued rebuilding 1903 sniper rifles as late as the early years of American involvement in Vietnam, extending the design's own genuine combat relevance into a third, entirely separate war fought more than 6 decades after the rifle's own original adoption. The same technical manuals mentioned at the very start of this video were still being printed and distributed as late as 1970, formal proof that the United States military had never actually finished needing the rifle it had officially declared obsolete more than 3 decades earlier, despite every intervening advance in rifle technology across those same decades. The rifle's own genuine second life extended beyond sniping alone into several other specialized roles. The Garand's own semi-automatic design proved considerably less suited to across the same war years. A spigot-type 22mm grenade launcher attachment fitted directly onto the 1903's own muzzle gave infantry grenadiers a genuinely effective way to launch rifle grenades considerably farther and more accurately than a soldier could manage throwing one by hand, a role the Garand's own gas-operated action could not easily accommodate without risking damage to the rifle's own delicate internal mechanism from the launch itself. Military police units also continued relying on the 1903 in its own later A3 variant throughout the entire war, a role that valued the rifle's own proven reliability and relative simplicity over the Garand's own faster rate of fire, which mattered considerably less to soldiers performing security and law enforcement duties than it did to infantry actually assaulting an enemy position under direct fire. Early in the war, before American production had even fully ramped up to meet its own domestic wartime needs, the United States supplied 1903s to British Home Guard units, desperately short of any defensive weapon at all, following the evacuation from Dunkirk, a stopgap measure that put an aging American rifle directly into the hands of British civilians preparing to defend their own homeland against a feared German invasion that in the end never actually came. Even senior American commanders occasionally demonstrated a genuine personal attachment to the older design that extended well beyond any purely practical justification, a detail that speaks to how deeply the rifle's own reputation had actually embedded itself within American military culture across its own long service history. General Matthew Ridgway, one of the most senior American commanders of the Korean War, reportedly maintained his own personal fondness for the 1903's own basic mechanical simplicity and inherent reliability, a preference shared by other senior officers who had themselves come up through the ranks during the rifle's own original heyday decades earlier, and who continued associating the design with a specific standard of soldierly competence. Newer weapons had not yet had the same decades of accumulated combat testing to actually earn for themselves in quite the same way. Collectors today generally sort surviving 1903 rifles according to a fairly detailed hierarchy shaped directly by this same long, complicated service history, genuine wartime sniper configurations, and rare early production variants commanding considerably higher prices than the far more common standard infantry examples manufactured in the millions across the design's own peak production years. The M1903A4 sniper variant, specifically produced in comparatively limited numbers relative to the standard infantry rifle it was actually built from, has become particularly sought after among serious collectors, specifically because of its own direct documented connection to the extended combat service. This entire video has just walked through a rifle whose own collector value today rests considerably more on its own genuine historical role than on any purely aesthetic or mechanical distinction from an ordinary example built from the exact same basic action. This is not a story about a rifle simply lingering past its own usefulness through bureaucratic inertia or sentimental attachment alone, since the specific reasons the 1903 kept returning to active service, wartime production shortfalls during the Second World War, and genuine ballistic advantages in the sniping role during Korea and Vietnam, were both entirely practical rather than nostalgic decisions made by officers who had every reason to prefer a more modern alternative if one had actually been readily available at the time. It is a story about how thoroughly a rifle's own supposed obsolescence can prove considerably more complicated in actual practice than any single official retirement date ever really captures on paper. A design good enough at one specific job, precision marksmanship, that the military kept quietly reaching for it decades after officially moving on to something newer for every other purpose an ordinary infantry rifle actually needed to serve. American allies benefited directly from the rifle's own extended service life as well. South Korean Marines armed with the 1903 throughout the Korean War alongside their own American counterparts, another example of the design finding continued relevance well beyond the borders of the country that had originally developed it decades earlier. The rifle itself had already evolved considerably across its own long production history, even before reaching this extended second career. The original 1903 design refined into the A1 variant in the late 1920s with an updated pistol grip stick, then simplified further into the wartime A3 configuration in 1942, specifically to speed up production using stamped metal components rather than the more time-consuming machined parts earlier versions had relied on, changes that mirror almost exactly the same kind of wartime manufacturing simplification this channel has already documented across several other American service weapons built under similarly urgent production pressure. The Springfield 1903's own civilian production continued until 1949, with a combined total exceeding 3 million rifles manufactured across the design's own entire production history, spanning nearly half a century of continuous or semi-continuous output across multiple entirely separate manufacturing eras and multiple entirely separate government contracts. The rifle remains genuinely popular today among collectors, competitive shooters, and civilian hunters who value the same fundamental accuracy that once made it the Army's preferred sniping platform for the better part of 6 decades across 3 entirely separate wars fought on 3 entirely different continents against 3 entirely different enemies. The United States Army Drill Team and Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps units across the country continue using the 1903 today in a purely ceremonial capacity. These precision-drilled rifle exhibitions trade on the same weight, balance, and mechanical presence that once made the design a genuinely formidable combat weapon, rather than on any of the rifle's own actual firing capability, which the ceremonial role never actually requires from the young cadets and soldiers performing with it today. A rifle that never actually finished serving after its own official 1937 retirement, so much as it simply changed jobs, trading frontline infantry service for a specialist role considerably better suited to what the design had actually excelled at from the very beginning, decades before anyone had specifically designed it with that eventual second career in mind at all, a career that by any honest measure ultimately proved every bit as consequential as the infantry service the rifle had originally been built for back in 1903. If you want more stories about the weapons that refuse to actually retire on schedule, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.